Fresh anti-government protests in Canada just 2 weeks ahead of the country's parliamentary elections. Thousands have marched through the streets of Montreal to protest against planned tuition hikes. The protesters, among them teachers and students, tore down signs of the ruling Liberal Party to show their anger at the government's plans. The protesters are angry at authorities for failing to listen to their demands, and they've promised to elect a new government when they will go to the polls on September 4th. A number of Canadian cities, including Quebec, have seen rallies against the planned tuition hikes in recent months. Some of those rallies had turned violent, with scores of student protesters detained during clashes with police. Press TV's Joshua Blakeney, our correspondent, joins me from Calgary to tell us more about these tuition hikes. Joshua, I mean, how much will these tuition hikes affect higher education in Canada? I mean, if this trend continues, we'll see universities almost empty.
Well, indeed, the political class, Hassan, has been doing their very best to try and make the protest dissipate, but they seem to be failing. On the 22nd of each month especially, there's been escalations on the streets of Montreal, and as you mentioned, throughout Canada. Even here in Calgary in the Canadian West tonight, there were students on the streets of Calgary signing their pots and pans, and this is a stronghold, of course, of the Harper government. So increasingly people in Canada are getting irritated with governments handing over the resource wealth to big corporations, and of course to corporations emanating from Houston and Dallas, invariably from the United States. Really, the struggle of the students is to defend Canadian sovereignty, to say why is it that there's so much resource wealth in this country, and yet the politicians are asking students to get in yet more debt in order to fund basic education. And so in Quebec, we've seen tens of thousands of students consistently coming out on the street with their supporters in the older generation to try and make the government back down on the proposed tuition hike. There's an ethos in Quebec to have a kind of social democracy like Scandinavia or somewhere like that, to try and have free healthcare, free education and so on. And as I say, the government's doing their very best to try and quell these protests by passing draconian pieces of legislation such as Bill 78, also known as Law 12, which actually proscribes basic civil liberties. One law professor said it's the second worst piece of legislation enshrined in Canadian history. So that's the nature of that piece of legislation. And of course, that piece of legislation, the draconian Bill 78, was ostensibly enacted in order to protect those students who want to go to university, who might be hindered from doing so by striking students, because of course there is the intention among those who have struck to form picket lines to draw attention to those students who aren't acting in solidarity with them and who are going along with this attack on education.
Indeed. I mean, in general, how will it cause difficulties for the students themselves in terms of, I mean, the student wants to clear off their loans, but with these hard economic times and, of course, the rise in unemployment, how difficult will it be for them?
Well, it would be very difficult because, of course, we see in Canada a lot of jobs now, like legal work and accounting work and such, is being offshored to countries like India and China. And so you have educated people coming out of universities and finding it very hard to find employment. And yet, at the same time, they're being asked to take on more debt. Because, of course, I think they're often relying on the naivety of young people who often enter university in Canada, say, at the age of 18 or 19, who will sign on to, take debt, because they don't really think of the consequences. And the political class is doing that in a highly nefarious way, critics allege, in order to cut the tax on the rich. That's the very rich who are, of course, despoiling the resources of the Canadian people. Quebec has hydro power, a lot of electric power generated there, which creates lucrative profits. There's diamonds, there's oil, there's gas, and the students aren't as stupid as the political class would like to think they are. The students are saying, why is it that we have such a small population in Canada of just about 34 million people, this abundance of wealth, and yet none of that's percolating down for basic liberties like having an education. And so the students aren't going to be able to afford to pay off these debts as we see unemployment escalating. And of course, Canada does most of its trade with the United States, and we see how the United States' economy is waning. And so that's the situation here in Canada, and the students are continuing to balloon in their numbers, tens of thousands coming to the streets with their supporters to show the Charest government and any other politician who supports the assault on their education that they're not going to tolerate this attack on post-secondary education in Canada.
Indeed. Well, on that note, we'll leave it there. Many thanks to Press TV's Joshua Blakeney reporting from Calgary. Joshua, thanks. Well, findings of a recent study show the US could fall into recession if Congress takes no action to stimulate the country's economy. The study carried out by the Congressional Budget Office says certain fiscal tightening measures need to be taken off the agenda to avoid